The emergency beacon cut through the void of space like a knife through silk, its desperate signal carrying across the star systems with a frequency that made every civilized species in the galaxy pause their daily routines. Emergency broadcasts were common enough. Ships broke down, colonies faced natural disasters, trade routes got disrupted by pirates. But this signal was different. This one carried the unmistakable digital signature of Earth. Ambassador Kethvar of the Zephyrian Council was in the middle of his morning meditation when his aide burst through the chamber doors, all 6 of his tentacles writhing with panic. "Ambassador! You need to see this immediately." Kethvar's 3 eyes narrowed in annoyance. The Zephyrians valued calm deliberation above all else, and such dramatic interruptions were considered deeply offensive. This had better be. "It's the humans, sir. They've sent out a priority alpha distress signal." The meditation cushion beneath Kethvar deflated as he sat up sharply. In the 47 years since humanity had joined the Galactic Federation, they had never, not once, sent out a priority alpha signal. The humans, those strange bipedal creatures from the infamous Deathworld Earth, were known throughout the galaxy for their stubborn independence and their disturbing tendency to solve their own problems, usually through methods that made other species deeply uncomfortable. "Play it," Kethvar commanded, his voice suddenly grave. The holographic display flickered to life, and a human face appeared, female, by their odd binary classification system, with the characteristic flat features and those unsettling predator eyes that could track movement with terrifying precision. Her dark hair was matted with what appeared to be blood, and her usually carefully controlled expression showed something that made Kethvar's tentacles curl in instinctive fear, desperation. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the UES Defiance, broadcasting on all Federation emergency frequencies." Her voice carried the calm authority that humans seemed to possess even in the face of death, but underneath it was something that made Kethvar's skin crawl. "Earth is under attack by an unknown alien force. Repeat, Earth is under attack. We have been overwhelmed. Our fleet is broken. Our orbital defenses are down. The enemy is..." She paused, and for a moment, the iron control slipped. "The enemy is unlike anything we've ever seen. They're not just trying to conquer us. They're trying to harvest us." The transmission crackled with interference, and Shen's image wavered. "Our population centers are under assault. Billions are dead or missing. We estimate we have perhaps 72 hours before complete planetary subjugation. We're not asking for military intervention, we know the Federation's policies on member conflicts. We're asking for evacuation assistance for our civilian populations and..." Her voice caught. "And if anyone receives this transmission, please remember that we tried. Humanity tried to stand." The transmission cut out, leaving the chamber in absolute silence. Kethvar stared at the empty hologram for a long moment, his mind racing. The Federation had strict non-interference policies regarding member world conflicts. It was one of the founding principles each species was expected to handle their own military affairs. But this was different. The humans weren't just another member species. They were the Deathworlders. "Sir," his aide ventured quietly. "What should we do?" Before Kethvar could answer, his communications array exploded with incoming signals. Every major species in the Federation was trying to reach him simultaneously. The Altarians, the Vok Collective, the hegemony of suns, everyone was responding to that signal. But as Kethvar scrolled through the priority messages, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Mixed in with the official governmental responses were dozens of other signals, each carrying the distinctive encryption patterns of independent operators, mercenary guilds, and exploration companies. And every single one of them was headed toward Earth. Not to help evacuate civilians. Not to provide humanitarian aid. They were going to watch the Deathworlders fall. Captain Vex Corlani of the independent vessel Nighthawk had been running cargo between the Outer Rim mining colonies when the signal came through. Like most of his kind Kethari traders who operated in the gray areas between legal and profitable, he had little love for the Federation's bureaucratic politics. But he had to admit, he was curious. Humans had always been an oddity in galactic civilization. When they'd first made contact 47 years ago, the initial surveys had classified Earth as a Class 12 Deathworld, a planet so hostile to life that it was considered barely habitable even by the most extreme terraforming standards. The fact that not only had life evolved there, but had produced a sapient species capable of space travel, had caused a minor crisis in xenobiological circles. Then the humans themselves had arrived at the first contact station. Vex still remembered the recordings from that day. The Federation's best diplomatic minds, species that had negotiated peace between warring empires and mediated conflicts that had lasted millennia, had spent 3 months trying to establish basic communication protocols with these bizarre Deathworld creatures. The humans had accomplished the same thing in 6 hours, despite having never encountered any alien species before. They learned Federation standard in 3 weeks. They'd absorbed galactic law, customs, and trade practices in 2 months. And then they'd submitted an application for Federation membership that was so thoroughly researched and carefully crafted that it had been approved on the first vote, something that had never happened in Federation history. But it wasn't their intelligence that had made them famous throughout the galaxy. It was what happened afterward. The first indication that humans were different came during the Centauri mining incident. A routine archaeological survey had awakened something in the ruins of an ancient civilization, something that had proceeded to kill 43 researchers and turn their minds into some kind of collective hive entity. The Federation's response had been measured and careful: quarantine the system, send in automated probes, study the problem, develop a solution over the course of several years. The human response had been to send in a single ship crewed by 12 volunteers. 12 humans had walked into a nightmare that had stumped the Federation's greatest minds, and 8 hours later, they'd walked out with the archaeological team's survivors and a complete analysis of the hostile entity's weaknesses. When questioned about their methodology, the human team leader had shrugged and said, "We've dealt with worse things on Earth." That had started the investigation into exactly what kind of place Earth really was. The reports had been classified at the highest levels, but rumors spread quickly through the merchant networks. Stories of a world where the dominant predators could run at speeds that would outpace most atmospheric vehicles, where the native plant life could kill a grown Altarian with a single touch, where the weather patterns included storms that generated more energy than most planetary defense systems. And humans had evolved to not just survive there, but to thrive. They hunted for sport, the kind of creatures that Federation military units would classify as extreme hazards. Their children played games that would be considered advanced combat training for most species. Their idea of relaxation often involved deliberately putting themselves in situations that activated every survival instinct other species possessed. But they were also inexplicably kind. Human traitors were known for their honesty. Human diplomats had mediated more successful peace negotiations than any other species. Human merchants would often sell goods at a loss to colonies in need, and human explorers had saved more lives in the past 4 decades than the rest of the Federation combined. It was that contradiction that had fascinated other species and made humans somewhat legendary in certain circles. They were simultaneously the most dangerous and most compassionate species anyone had ever encountered. And now someone was trying to wipe them out. Vex altered his course toward Earth, but not out of any sense of justice or compassion. He was a traitor, and he knew an opportunity when he saw one. Whatever force was attacking the humans had to be using some impressive technology to overwhelm a Deathworld species. That technology would be worth a fortune on the black market, assuming anyone was left alive to study it. He wasn't the only one with that idea. His sensor readings showed at least 40 other independent vessels converging on the Sol system, all running silent and staying well outside normal patrol routes. They were vultures, coming to pick at the bones of whatever was left after the humans fell. Vex had to admit, there was a certain poetic justice to it. For decades, the humans had been the ones picking apart the ruins of other civilizations, studying their failures, learning from their mistakes. Now someone would finally get to study theirs. The irony was delicious. On the bridge of the UES Defiance, Admiral Sarah Chen watched the tactical display with the kind of calm that came from accepting the inevitable. The massive dreadnought hung in Earth's upper atmosphere like a wounded giant, its hull scarred by weapons that seemed to burn rather than blast, its crew reduced to a fraction of normal operating capacity. "Status report," she called out, her voice steady despite everything. Commander Torres, her XO, looked up from his console with the expression of a man reporting the end of the world.
Orbital platforms 7 through 15 are completely offline. The Beijing and the Yorktown are confirmed destroyed. The rest of the fleet is.
He paused, consulting his readings.
Ma'am, we've lost 73% of our total tonnage. Chen nodded as if this was merely mildly inconvenient news.
It was a skill she'd learned over her 30-year career. In crisis situations, the crew needed to see their commander as unshakable, even when the situation was objectively hopeless.
And the enemy? That's the problem, ma'am. We don't know. They're using some kind of adaptive shielding that makes our weapons less effective with each hit.
Energy weapons seem to have almost no impact after the first few shots.
Kinetic weapons work better, but they're learning to counter those too.
Chen turned her attention to the main display, where the enemy vessels hung in Earth's sky like malevolent stars. They were unlike anything in Federation databases, organic-looking things that seemed to grow and shift as she watched, their hulls rippling with bioluminescent patterns that might have been beautiful under other circumstances. But it wasn't their ships that made this enemy so terrifying. It was their tactics. Most galactic warfare followed predictable patterns established over millennia of conflict. You targeted military installations, conquered strategic positions, negotiated terms for civilian populations. War was brutal, but it followed rules, had objectives, had endpoints. These things weren't conquering Earth. They were farming it. The first wave had targeted not military installations, but population centers. But instead of bombardment, they'd deployed some kind of collection devices, massive biomechanical constructs that had descended on cities and begun systematically harvesting human beings.
Not killing them, harvesting them.
The reports from the surface were unclear, but it seemed like people were being taken alive and processed for something. The second wave had been stranger still. Instead of pressing their advantage, the enemy had seemed to wait, studying human responses, adapting their tactics based on whatever data they were collecting. It was as if the entire attack was some kind of research project, and humanity was the test subject. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Kim called from the communications station.
"We're receiving multiple incoming signals.
Federation response teams are en route."
Chen felt a spark of hope. "How many? What's their ETA?" Kim's expression fell. "Ma'am, they're not military vessels. They're civilian ships. Traders, exploration vessels, independent operators.
And they're not approaching Earth.
They're setting up observation positions at the edge of the system."
The spark of hope died. Chen had been in space long enough to recognize vultures when she saw them. They're here to watch us die.
"Ma'am, there's something else. Long-range sensors are picking up massive energy signatures moving through hyperspace. Multiple fleets, approaching from different vectors. The computer estimates arrival in 6 hours.
Chen felt her blood run cold.
6 hours. Whatever force had sent these bioships was bringing reinforcements.
This wasn't just an attack on Earth, it was the beginning of something much larger.
"Commander Torres," she said quietly. "Are our quantum communications still functional?"
"Yes, ma'am, but barely.
The enemy seems to be jamming most frequencies."
"Send a message to every human settlement, every human ship, every human colony in known space.
Authenticated command codes, maximum priority. Tell them."
She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Tell them that Earth is lost, but that humanity will continue. Tell them to remember us, and to never trust anything that comes from the Sol system after today." As Torres bent over his console to encode the message, Chen turned back to the tactical display. The enemy bioships were moving again, descending toward the surface in a coordinated pattern that spoke of terrifying intelligence and planning.
Humanity had always prided itself on being adaptable, on being survivors. But they'd never faced anything like this. For the first time in their species' history, humans were encountering something that was simply better at being human than they were. And the most terrifying part was that these things weren't even fighting them. They were studying them.
Dr. Elena Vasquez had been working in the emergency command center beneath the Rockies when the attack began.
As Earth's leading xenobiologist and one of the foremost experts on non-human intelligence, she'd been called in the moment the first bioships had appeared in Earth's sky. 48 hours later, she was beginning to understand exactly what humanity was facing, and the knowledge was more terrifying than anything she'd encountered in 20 years of studying the galaxy's most dangerous lifeforms. They're not just harvesting people, she explained to the assembled military leaders, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and horror. They're harvesting us specifically. Their collection patterns are too precise, too targeted. They're not taking random samples, they're selecting for specific genetic markers, neural patterns, even psychological profiles. General Morrison, the highest-ranking surviving officer in the Mountain Command, leaned forward over the tactical table. What do you mean, selecting for? Elena brought up a holographic display showing the enemy's attack patterns overlaid with population data. Look at this. New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, they hit the largest population centers first, but not randomly. They're targeting areas with the highest concentrations of what we might call human diversity. Not just genetic diversity, but cultural, intellectual, creative diversity. I don't understand, Morrison said. If they wanted genetic samples, wouldn't it be more efficient to just grab whoever was easiest to reach? That's what I thought at first. But look at this data. Elena manipulated the display, showing a detailed breakdown of the collection patterns. They're not just taking people. They're taking specific types of people. Scientists, artists, athletes, soldiers, engineers, teachers, but not just any scientists or artists or soldiers. They're selecting for the best. The most creative, the most intelligent, the most physically capable, the most emotionally resilient. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They're building something, Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't conquest. This isn't even genocide. They're trying to create their own humans. Morrison's face had gone pale. That's impossible. You can't just create a species. You can if you have enough raw material and sufficient understanding of the underlying patterns. Elena pulled up another display, this one showing the biological scans they'd managed to collect from the enemy ships. These bioships aren't just ships. They're mobile laboratories. And they're not just studying us, they're reverse engineering us. Before anyone could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the command center. A technician called out from the communication station, multiple hyperspace breaches detected. Something big is coming out of jump space. The main display switched to show the tactical situation in orbit around Earth. What they saw made every person in the room step backward involuntarily. Ships were emerging from hyperspace, but not enemy ships. These vessels were sleek and deadly, their hulls marked with the distinctive insignia of dozens of different species. Federation ships, independent traders, mercenary fleets, exploration vessels, the space around Earth was filling with every type of spacecraft known to galactic civilization. But they weren't moving to engage the enemy. They were setting up what could only be described as observation platforms, positioning themselves like spectators at some kind of sporting event. My God, Morrison whispered. They're here to watch us die. Elena stared at the display, her mind racing. Something was wrong with this picture. The approaching fleet was too large, too diverse, too organized. You didn't get this kind of response from a simple distress signal, especially not when the Federation's official policy was non-interference. No, she said slowly. That's not why they're here. What do you mean? Elena pointed at the enemy bioships, which had suddenly stopped their harvesting operations and were beginning to form up in what looked like defensive formations. Look at the enemy response. They're not ignoring the arriving ships, they're treating them as a threat. But those are just civilian vessels, Anne. And 47 years ago, when humanity first joined the Federation, we were just another species with a curious evolutionary background, Elena interrupted. But something has changed. Something about this situation is different from anything that's happened before. As if in response to her words, the communications array crackled to life with an incoming transmission. But this wasn't coming from any of the arriving ships. The signal was coming from somewhere much farther away, somewhere outside the solar system entirely. The voice that came through the speakers was distinctly human, but there was something different about it, something harder, more dangerous than any human voice Elena had ever heard. "This is Captain James Harrison of the UES Ragnarok, transmitting on all frequencies. We have received Earth's distress signal. We are en route with a full battle group. To any Federation observers currently in the system, you have 30 minutes to clear the area before we arrive. This is not a request." Elena felt her heart skip a beat. The UES Ragnarok had been lost in deep space 15 years ago, along with her sister ships, during an exploration mission that had gone missing in the Galactic Rim territories. They'd been presumed destroyed. But there was something else about that transmission that made her blood run cold. The signal wasn't coming from the edge of the solar system. It wasn't even coming from anywhere within a light year of Earth. The signal was coming from hyperspace itself. Captain James Harrison stood on the bridge of the UES Ragnarok, watching the hyperspace tunnel collapse around his ship as they dropped back into normal space. Behind him, through the dimensional rift that was already sealing itself, he could see the rest of his fleet following, ship after ship emerging from a realm where the normal laws of physics held only loose sway. 15 years. 15 years since he and his battle group had been lost in the deep black, pursuing signals from the galactic rim that had turned out to be something far stranger than anyone had imagined. 15 years of fighting a war that the rest of humanity didn't even know was happening. 15 years of learning things about the universe that made the Federation's careful scientific understanding look like children's drawings. And now they were home, just in time to find Earth under attack by the same force they'd been fighting all this time. "Status report," Harrison called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding ships in battles where the stakes were literally the survival of reality itself. "All ships have successfully translated from hyperspace," reported his XO, Commander Sarah Park. "Fleet integrity is holding. We're reading massive biological signatures in Earth orbit, consistent with Harvest Fleet configurations." Harrison nodded grimly. The enemy had a name now, though it was a name that most humans wouldn't recognize. The collective and ancient force that moved through the galaxy like a plague, harvesting sapient species not for food or slaves, but for something far more disturbing. They collected civilizations. Not their technology or their resources, but their essential nature, their unique approaches to existence. They were building something, a vast repository of consciousness and capability that spanned multiple galaxies and existed in dimensions that human science was only beginning to understand. And they had finally noticed humanity. "Sir," called Lieutenant Chen from the sensor station. "Federation vessels are withdrawing from the system. Looks like they took your 30-minute warning seriously. Good. Lock onto the Harvest Fleet and prepare to engage. All ships, full combat protocols." Harrison turned to look at the main display, where Earth hung like a blue-green jewel surrounded by the nightmare shapes of the enemy bioships. He'd seen those ships before, in the deep black between galaxies where normal space folded in on itself and things that shouldn't exist hunted among the stars. But he'd also learned how to fight them. "Sir," Commander Park said quietly, "we should inform Earth Command of our arrival. They probably think we're dead." "They probably think they're dead too," Harrison replied. "Signal Admiral Chan on the Defiance. Let her know that the cavalry has arrived." As the Ragnarok and her sister ships moved into Earth's gravity well, their hulls began to change. The polished metal surfaces that had left Earth orbit 15 years ago were gone, replaced by something that looked almost organic, marked with symbols and patterns that seemed to shift when you looked at them directly. These weren't the same ships that had left Earth. They weren't even exactly the same crew. 15 years of fighting the collective had changed them in ways that would have horrified the Federation's medical experts and made their scientists question everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality. But they were still human. And someone was threatening their home. Aboard the Nighthawk, Captain Vex Corlani watched his sensors with growing unease as the human fleet materialized in Earth's vicinity. Something was very wrong with those ships. His instruments couldn't get consistent readings, they seemed to phase in and out of normal space, and their energy signatures were unlike anything in Federation databases. "Captain," his navigator called out, her voice tight with concern. "Those human ships, they're not registering as normal matter. My sensors keep classifying them as dimensional anomalies. Vex studied the readouts more carefully.
His navigator was right, the approaching human vessels seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially somewhere else entirely. It was as if they were projections from another dimension, solid enough to affect the physical world but not entirely bound by its laws. How is that possible? He muttered to himself. His question was answered when the lead human ship, something called the Ragnarok according to his database, opened fire on the nearest enemy bioship.
The weapons that lanced out from the human vessel weren't anything Vex recognized.
They weren't energy beams or kinetic projectiles or particle streams. They were something that made reality itself seem to ripple and tear around their passage, as if the very fabric of spacetime was being used as a weapon. The enemy bioship, which had been shrugging off Federation standard weapons with contemptuous ease, simply ceased to exist where the human weapons touched it. Not destroyed, not vaporized, deleted, as if it had never been there in the first place.
Mother of stars, Vex whispered. What have they become?
Around the solar system, other independent observers were having similar realizations. The humans who had left Earth 15 years ago had returned as something that defied classification.
They fought like humans, with tactical brilliance, ruthless efficiency, and an almost casual disregard for odds that should have been overwhelming.
But they fought with weapons and technologies that seemed to treat the fundamental laws of physics as optional suggestions. The bioships of the collective began to respond, their organic hulls shifting and adapting as they tried to counter the human assault. For months, they had been effortlessly overwhelming human defenders, learning from each engagement and becoming more effective with each battle. But these humans weren't fighting like anything the collective had encountered before. They weren't using energy weapons that could be adapted against, or kinetic weapons that could be deflected, or even exotic matter weapons that could be absorbed and analyzed. They were fighting with reality itself as their weapon, and reality wasn't something that could be easily adapted to. Dr. Elena Vasquez watched the battle from the emergency command center, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing on the tactical displays. The human ships moved through space in patterns that violated everything she knew about physics, their weapons tearing holes in the enemy formation that seemed to spread like infections, unmating more bioships than they actually hit. "This is impossible," she said, not for the first time in the past hour. "Those ships are violating at least 17 different physical laws. They can't exist." General Morrison was focused on more practical concerns.
"I don't care how they exist. Are they winning?" Elena consulted her readouts.
The answer was as impossible as everything else she was seeing.
Yes. They're not just winning, they're dominating.
The enemy ships that have been adapting to our weapons for 2 days can't even begin to counter whatever the Ragnarok battle group is using.
How many ships does Harrison have?
That's the thing, Elena said slowly.
I can't get an accurate count.
My sensors show anywhere from 12 ships to over 100, depending on when I take the reading.
It's as if they exist in a quantum superposition, multiple realities simultaneously.
Morrison stared at her.
Are you telling me that our own people have become some kind of, interdimensional entities? Before Elena could answer, the communications array activated with an incoming transmission from the Ragnarok. Mountain Command, this is Captain Harrison. We're going to need you to evacuate everyone from the surface within the next 6 hours. We're about to do something that's going to make the planet temporarily uninhabitable. Morrison grabbed the microphone. Captain Harrison, this is General Morrison. What exactly are you planning to do?
We're going to close the dimensional gateway the collective has opened in Earth's core, Harrison's voice replied, with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather.
The process is going to release a lot of exotic energy. Nothing permanently harmful, but the atmosphere is going to be toxic to human life for about a week. Elena felt her blood run cold. There's no dimensional gateway in Earth's core. We would have detected something like that. Negative, Dr. Vasquez. The gateway exists in 11 dimensions. Your sensors can only detect activity in the first 4. The collective has been using Earth as an anchor point for a transgalactic harvesting operation. We're going to cut their anchor chain. Morrison was staring at the tactical display where the impossible human ships continued their impossible battle. Harrison, where the hell have you been for 15 years? There was a long pause before Harrison answered, and when he did, his voice carried a weight that spoke of experiences that no human should have had to endure. We've been at war, General. A war that started when we followed those signals from the galactic rim and discovered that the universe is much bigger and much more dangerous than the Federation ever imagined. We've been fighting to keep things like this from happening to Earth, to humanity, to any species that doesn't deserve to be harvested by forces that treat entire civilizations like crops. And you learned how to do whatever it is you're doing? We learned how to survive, Harrison replied simply. And survival, when you're fighting entities that exist across multiple dimensions and treat physical laws as suggestions, requires you to become something more than what you were when you started. Elena found herself stepping closer to the microphone. Captain Harrison, from a scientific standpoint, what you're doing is impossible. Your ships, your weapons, your very existence violates fundamental principles of. Dr. Harrison interrupted, and there was something almost gentle in his voice. Science is about understanding the universe as it is, not as we think it should be. The universe is stranger and more vast than anything the Federation has taught us. What seems impossible to you is just Tuesday for us. On the tactical display, the last of the enemy bioships was being systematically dissolved by weapons that turned matter into something that was neither energy nor mass, but something else entirely. The Collective's harvest fleet, which had been on the verge of processing the entire human population, was ceasing to exist in ways that made Elena's head hurt to contemplate. Now, Harrison continued, you have 6 hours to evacuate every human being from Earth's surface. I suggest you get started. The evacuation of Earth was, by any measure, the largest logistical undertaking in human history. In 6 hours, the combined efforts of the surviving orbital stations, the mysterious return fleet, and even some of the independent observer vessels that had lingered in the system managed to evacuate nearly 2 billion people to temporary shelters in space and on Luna. It wasn't everyone. It couldn't be everyone. But it was enough to ensure that humanity would survive whatever Captain Harrison was planning to do to their homeworld. From the observation deck of the evacuation ship New Hope, Elena Vasquez watched as the Ragnarok descended toward Earth's atmosphere. The ship moved like something alive, its hull shifting and flowing as it encountered the planet's magnetic field. Around it, space itself seemed to ripple and bend, as if reality was making room for something that didn't quite belong in normal existence. What are they going to do? Asked General Morrison, who stood beside her at the observation port. Elena checked her instruments one more time, hoping against hope that she'd misread the energy signatures building around Earth. She hadn't. They're going to turn Earth into a weapon, she said quietly. Morrison looked at her sharply. What do you mean? I mean they're using the planet itself as a focusing device for some kind of dimensional manipulation. Whatever gateway the Collective opened, Harrison's people are going to use Earth as a giant lever to not just close it, but to make sure it can never be opened again. And that's going to make the planet uninhabitable? Elena was quiet for a long moment, studying readings that made no sense according to any science she knew. General, I don't think they're just closing a gateway. I think they're editing reality. They're changing the fundamental nature of spacetime in this region to make it incompatible with whatever dimensional technology the Collective uses. Is that even possible? A week ago, I would have said no. Today, Elena gestured toward the tactical display, where Earth was beginning to glow with energies that existed in spectrums her instruments couldn't properly measure. Today I'm starting to understand that everything we thought we knew about the universe was just the introduction to the textbook. As they watched, reality around Earth began to change. It was subtle at first, just a shimmering in space, like heat distortion over pavement on a summer day. But gradually, it became more pronounced. Space itself seemed to be taking on a different quality, as if the physical laws that governed this region of the galaxy were being rewritten on a fundamental level. And at the center of it all, Earth turned like a blue-green jewel, its surface beginning to glow with patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some vast heartbeat. Captain Harrison stood in what had once been the Ragnarok's bridge, though after 15 years of modification and evolution, it bore little resemblance to anything that would have been familiar to a Federation engineer. The walls were alive with circuits that grew like vines, displays that showed information in 11 dimensions simultaneously,
and control interfaces that responded to thought as much as touch. "Sir," reported his XO, "Commander Park, dimensional anchor points are locked.
Earth's gravitational field is synchronized with the transdimensional matrix. We're ready to begin the reality cascade."
Harrison nodded, his attention focused on the impossible readings flowing across his displays.
The Collective's gateway was massive, larger than anything they'd encountered before.
It stretched from Earth's core to points in at least 7 other galaxies, allowing the harvesting fleet to coordinate its activities across a scope that would have made Federation strategists despair. But size, as Harrison had learned over 15 years of fighting in the Deep Black, was often a weakness rather than a strength. The larger something was, the more leverage you could apply against it. "Begin the cascade," he ordered. Around Earth, space began to change. It started small, just a ripple in the quantum foam that surrounded the planet, barely detectable even by the Ragnarok's advanced sensors. But the ripple spread, gaining strength and momentum as it propagated outward from Earth's gravity well. Where the wave passed, the fundamental constants of reality shifted. Not much, just enough to make the universe in this region incompatible with the type of dimensional manipulation the Collective used. Like changing the frequency of a radio signal by just a few hertz, making it impossible for their receivers to lock onto the transmission. But the wave wasn't stopping at the edge of the solar system. It was following the Collective's own gateway system, spreading along their dimensional network like a virus, carrying the reality cascade to every point in space where they had established an anchor. "Sir," Commander Park said, her voice tight with something that might have been awe or terror, "the cascade is propagating beyond our calculations.
It's spreading through their entire network."
Harrison watched his displays as the wave of altered reality moved through dimensions that human mathematics could barely describe, following pathways that the Collective had spent millions of years establishing across multiple galaxies.
"How far?" he asked. "Unknown, sir. The cascade is using their own infrastructure to propagate. It could reach."
Park paused, checking her readings. "Sir, this could affect their operations across the entire galactic cluster." Harrison was quiet for a moment, considering the implications. When he and his fleet had been lost in the Deep Black 15 years ago, they'd discovered that the Collective wasn't just one species or even one civilization. It was a meta-entity that spanned multiple galaxies, harvesting entire civilizations to feed something vast and hungry that existed in the spaces between realities. They'd been fighting a holding action ever since, trying to protect individual worlds and species while searching for some way to strike at the Collective's core operations. They'd never imagined that Earth itself would provide the leverage they needed. "Let it spread," Harrison said finally. "It's time this universe learned that some prey fights back." Across the galaxy, in places where the normal laws of physics held less sway than the will of entities that had been ancient when the first stars formed, the Collective felt the wave of altered reality propagating through their network like a disease. For the first time in millions of years, the meta-entity that coordinated their harvesting operations across countless worlds experienced something that could only be described as pain.
The humans had done something impossible.
They had weaponized reality itself, turning the very fabric of spacetime into a tool for severing the dimensional pathways that the Collective relied upon. In a single stroke, they had undone thousands of years of careful infrastructure development. But more than that, they had demonstrated something that the Collective had never encountered before, a species that could adapt not just tactically or technologically, but fundamentally. These creatures had changed their own nature in response to threat, becoming something that existed partially outside the normal constraints of physical law. They had become something that the Collective could not harvest. For the first time in its existence, the meta-entity experienced fear. The wave of altered reality reached its maximum propagation 6 hours.